When considering Western approaches to learning and how the history of the region has influenced its development, we often focus, rather disproportionately, on one man, Socrates. One might infer from this that the Socratic ideals have always formed the bedrock of learning and thought in the West, and that the man himself constituted the constant secular deity of European thinking. But history is rarely that straightforward. A simplistic view of pure Socratic influence may form a helpful juxtaposition with the East Confucian philosophy, but this ignores the over 2,000 years of history that followed their deaths. A culture's approach to learning is a melting pot, a broth of constantly fluctuating ingredients made increasingly volatile by relentless waves of wars, plagues, revolutions, and social upheavals. There is one period of European history, both blessed and cursed with all these historical markers in excess, though shamefully too often ignored by those wishing to understand the West development: the medieval era. Often labelled as the Middle or Dark Ages, they are burdened by a perception of constituting Europe's awkward phase, bringing to mind images of Westerners developing a sudden and furious obsession with crawling around in the mud and hitting each other with swords. And while there was quite a bit of that, there was also some incredibly important developments happening in the field of learning and education that would come to define the modern sphere of academia. Education in the early medieval era was done primarily through either cathedral or monastic schools. You may notice that both of these institutional options have a distinct religious flavour. This is no coincidence. Pre-Enlightenment learning, knowledge, and indeed everyday life were dominated by ecclesiastical centres of power. It is impossible to understand learning in the West without consideration of Christianity's impact. This was not necessarily some tyrannical suppression of free, scientific thought. Despite modern stereotypes of science and religion constituting opposite forces locked in some eternal battle for supremacy, the Middle Ages show very much the opposite of this. The acquisition of knowledge, scientific or otherwise, was organised and undergone within the bounds of Christianity to better understand God's work. From this reconciliation of reasoning and religion rose Scholasticism. Developed within the halls and cloisters of the monastic schools, Scholasticism is not so much a philosophy or a theology, but a method of learning, one which placed a major emphasis on critical debate, having two speakers of opposing views arguing and counter-arguing, using their extended knowledge and inference to reach a conclusion on the matter. This may all sound eerily familiar. This is because, though originally applied to religious debate, Scholasticism was soon expanded to encompass almost every facet of academia and came to define the universities that began to spring up across the continent. Now that we have some substantial background on the period, this next section will look in greater detail at some of the wonderful medieval illustrations that are flashed across this screen and consider what they tell us about cultural approaches to learning within Vygotsky's framework. Our first image comes from the, pardon my French, Grande Chronique de France, or Great Chronicles of France, a royal compilation of the history of France first compiled in 1270 AD. One later manuscript of this work contains the illustration of a lecture taking place at the University of Paris. Looking at the scene, we see a textbook example of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, though in this scenario the students are adults, given the university setting. On the left we can see a teacher, most likely a senior ecclesiastical figure, acting as the most knowledgeable other. He uses his more advanced knowledge in conjunction with the reading material in front of him to construct a scaffold around which the students are able to learn. Interestingly, from a cultural perspective, all of the seated students have shaved heads, forming the tonsure or monastic crown. The act of shaving one's head for religious purposes is a common one across many cultures, though in the Christian faith this is meant to emulate the crown of thorns placed upon Christ's head during the crucifixion. This once again highlights the importance of religion in the learning traditions of the time, manifesting not only in theoretical frameworks, but in physical appearances. A second illustration, this time from 14th century Italy, depicts a similar teacher-student dynamic. By swapping out the period clothing and adding in some laptops and women, this scene is replicated almost daily at every modern university around the world. Finally, we return to this image from the Bible Moralisée, depicting God as architect of the world. For contemporary scholars, God created the universe according to geometric and harmonic principles, meaning the study of geometry and astronomy were divine and therefore a path to God. From a cultural historical approach, this shows us not only what motivated and shaped medieval learning, but what specific areas of study were granted greater focus and prestige. These illustrations also hold a meta-narrative of learning.
Images would decorate places of worship as frescoes or stained glass windows for the benefit of the mostly illiterate medieval population. For these people, religious learning came equally from the interpretation of works of art as it did from the Word of God. I would like to now acknowledge the input of my critical feedback group, each of whom were incredibly supportive. Throughout a series of meetings, group chat discussions, and online documents, they provided comment on both the structure and content of the piece. The idea of moving past a limited conception of Socratic influence was one they were particularly interested in, and highlighted to me that a similar religious scientific nexus was taking place in the Arabic world in the same period.